So we're going to start off by looking at the 5 characteristics of student-centered learning. And basically that means, how do you know if something is truly student-centered? So you might do an activity and you might think this is great, they're on their own, but is it truly student-centered learning, or is it the kids are just working on something? And there is a really distinct difference. Just because students are working without guidance or direct instruction from the teacher does not mean that it's student-centered. And I can't harp on that enough. Again, a lot of the articles and stuff that I have read that kind of say, student-centered learning, it's not good. They think that, this misconstrued notion of what it is how it goes, and it is not. So the first piece of it is that there is a high degree of student engagement, okay? And the key word here is engagement. So people often say, well, if they're sitting there and they're doing work, how in the world would that not be engagement? And I kind of always say, think about it as if you're reading a book, okay? Everybody is reading, but sometimes your mind gets a little bit distracted and it kind of goes off on and thinks about something. Next thing you know, you got to go back and reread what you did. Okay, you read it, okay, but you didn't understand it. You didn't remember it. You had to go back and do it again. So were you reading? Yes, but were you reading with engagement? No. Okay, but we've all been there where we're reading something and we get absolutely lost in it. We see ourselves in that scene. We can picture it happening, and you're really, really engaged in that book. Okay, so that's kind of the difference if you want to think of it in those terms. Are they just sort of going through the motions, or are they really immersing themselves into what they're doing? All right, and that does not have to look the same for every student. So this is something that makes people take a step back and say, well, I don't really understand what that means. Okay, the first idea is that it's really an outdated concept in this day and age that everybody should be learning the same thing in the same way. We know that there are different learning styles out there. So what might work well for one person isn't going to, work the same way for another one. But we know they all have to get the same information. Okay. And if you kind of think about it, we're told all the time as teachers that we do need to differentiate. So how could it be that we're expected to teach everybody the same thing in the same way if we're also expected to differentiate for our different students, their learning styles, any special needs they might have, so on and so forth? So when you kind of think about it that way, you need something that does that naturally. And student-centered learning actually differentiates naturally in your classroom. So let me explain. Again, kind of putting a thought out there. Think about if you're trying to teach your students to dance. Okay, love this movie. What you have here are 2 students dancing, okay? But are they dancing the exact same way? No. Okay, you can say they're both dancing. They understand that you have to go with the music and there is a beat and there's movement and this and that, but you have 2 very distinct ways of dancing here. So even though it's not the same for everyone, they are still dancing. They still understand the concept of what it is that they need to be doing and how to do it, but it doesn't look the same for each one of them. Wrap your head around that for a second. Okay. And backing up, think about what it's like grading. Okay. If you're grading the same thing over and over again, it gets monotonous. We've all been there. Okay. But if you have all your students working on a concept and showing the different ways that they understand that concept, it's never going to get boring for you because you're going to be seeing different things that are maybe sparking your own interest in the subject in different ways that you didn't think of. There's a lot of learning that happens from your students to you, as well as, your students learning from your lessons. Okay, something else. Not every student needs to be working on the same thing. This is another thing that people say, I don't understand. I have a lesson plan. I need to stick to it. Well, that's a little bit about the differentiating. So obviously, there's a curriculum that you have to cover. Every student needs to know X, Y, and Z. Okay, and they have to have the baseline info of that to make sure that they are all on the same page. Now, what I would suggest, and I can get into this later on, is flipping the classroom. So instead of the traditional idea where the students learn content in the classroom and then they take home homework to reinforce it, the homework is learning that baseline information. So learning the very basic idea of whatever the concept is. And then in class, you're doing things to further their knowledge. A lot of data is saying that's actually a better model because most of the time when students have questions about what they've learned, it's when they're home doing their homework and the teacher isn't there. So if they have questions, they bring them into class, and you can guide what goes on in the classroom based off of those questions. Flipping the classroom is great. There's a lot that goes into planning it out to make sure that it works. But again, that's something that I could get into later. So what they end up doing in the classroom when they are all together should reflect their own learning style. Okay, so you have visual learners, you have auditory learners, kinesthetic learners. We know the different types. You probably know right off the bat what type of learner you are, okay? But you would come up with different activities that reinforce the material, but the students can choose from to figure out which one they can adapt to the best. So for instance, if a student has a really strong desire to build things, maybe you can come up with some type of an activity for whatever the lesson might be, where they can be hands-on actually crafting something. Because if they have an interest in it and they know that it's something that they excel at, they're going to dive into the project a little bit more, dive into that assignment. They're going to have a stronger level of engagement than if it's something that they really have no interest in doing. All right. And with that, a student should always be able to tell you why they're doing what they're doing. And this is a little bit tricky, okay? A lot of times as teachers, we sit back and we come up with these lessons and we say, oh, this is going to be amazing, and they're going to love this, and they're going to do it, and it's going to be great, and they're going to learn what they need to. But was there enough lead into it that the students get, okay, this is why we're doing this? All right. This is really key, and for a number of reasons. Number one, you know that the outcomes are going to be appropriate for your students. Number two, it's great if you get observed, just kind of throwing that out there. I don't know about you guys, but I know every time that I have been observed, the supervisor has kind of walked around and sort of asked the kids, well, what are you doing right now? What are you learning? And when they know exactly what they're doing, it really shows well for you, and it will reflect back well. So, a student should be able to say, I'm working on this ed puzzle right now because I didn't have a chance to finish it for homework. So I'm finishing it now because then I'll be able to do the scavenger hunt activity that is planned, and I'll understand the different points that are being made in that. Or, we're currently building structures with toothpicks and Play-Doh, trying to show different columns and pillars to display how difficult Renaissance architecture was to design. All right. It might seem like, oh my goodness, obviously those are higher level answers, for older students. Younger students would be able to do it on their own terms. But they want to be able to say, okay, we're doing this for a purpose, not we're just doing this because. So you want to make sure that they, in fact, can do that. Okay, and on with that, there should always be movement in the classroom. Now, obviously, this GIF here is ridiculous, but I saw it and it made me laugh, so I felt the need to put it in here. But gone are the days where we are in an industrial model. So when education first began, it was to teach students how to become citizens. Okay, so you had rows of desks where they would sit down and they would be quiet for the whole time they were there, and they would do exactly what they were told in the exact way that they were told, and there wasn't a question of it. We're not in an industrial society anymore. So trying to teach them the ways that worked for that society don't really pan out anymore. So, moving around, being able to get up and move to a different spot in the classroom. If you want to sit, awesome. If you want to stand and do your work, great. But having a variety of ways for the students to be comfortable in doing their work will have way better benefits for what they end up giving to you. I explained this concept at back to school night one night, and the parents came in, and I had, yoga balls and pillows and regular desks and tables and everything all set up. And I explained to them, they come in and they sign out where they want to go depending on the activity that we're doing, and they get themselves situated. And the work that I'm getting from them is so much better because they're comfortable. I know, me personally, if I'm working on something, generally I'm like kind of, sitting back, but my legs are straight out, kind of like on a couch or whatever. That's where I work best. My husband has to sit, at a desk, and that's fine. But we work in very, very different ways. And neither one of us is as productive if we are doing what the other one is doing, that they're more comfortable. And the one mom had a complete revelation when I said that. She goes, every day when I get to work, I get my cup of coffee and I get settled in the seat. And, I turn on my radio station and then I get myself together, and then I can get started. She goes, if I have to do that as an adult, I can only imagine that they need to do that as kids when they're still learning how to function like that. And it made me really happy because that was exactly the purpose of being able to, have the movement and move around. And honestly, you will get better results from your students if they're, in a more comfortable environment than if they are uncomfortable in what they are doing. Okay. And then lastly, the teacher is the biggest reference material in the room. So another, notion about student-centered learning, which actually will segue nicely into where we're going into next, is that the teacher kicks back and can just hang out while the students do all the work. That's absolutely not the case whatsoever. So the teacher's job in a student-centered classroom is to be facilitating. So there's a lot of work on the back end to make sure that you have the activities ready and you know where your students are so you can kind of guide them on where they should be going. You're judging sort of how long things should take. And, if some students finish quickly, what else can they do to kind of extend their learning, so on and so forth. And all that is with constant monitoring of your classroom. So whether you have mastery guides or you're following online data as they're completing assignments, you're always aware of where your students are in the classroom. So even though it might look like you're, sitting at your computer, you could be analyzing data. And with that data, you're determining where this class is going to go. So if they get really, really into an assignment and they're going to need more time to do it right, you're going to automatically adjust to create the time. Okay. Deadlines, even though sometimes they need to be firm, obviously, because we all have curriculum to get through, can you kind of wiggle it a little bit to give them more time on this thing that they're really, really engaged in, and, work it out differently later on. And you're literally structuring everything that you're doing based off of what you're seeing. If they're not engaging in the activities that you have, come up with something that they will in fact engage in. Maybe it just needs to be tweaked a little bit or explained in a different way, or maybe they should actually be working in small groups, or you have to try to gauge your students to figure out what's going to work best with them. You should be if you're not analyzing data, you should be mixed in with your students, sitting down with them at their desks or on the floor or wherever and kind of asking them questions. As they ask you questions, you should be responding with questions or guiding them to answers as opposed to just giving it to them. Because the harder they work for it, the more they're going to understand it and the more they're going to remember it. And that's what we want to make sure that we're doing in our classrooms, is making sure that our students remember what they're doing as opposed to cramming it, which is what a teacher-led classroom often lends itself to. And you should also always be available. So even if you are working with a group or if you're following up the data and trying to figure that out, you should really know, what's going on. I always had help boards on my walls. So like if I was working, a kid could write, their name that they need assistance with something if, the people that they're working with or around weren't sure. And that way I knew, okay, next I need to go over to them to make sure that they're on the page that they need to be on. A lot of times they just need, confidence that they know where they are. So, you're always available no matter where you are. And you're really still the biggest reference. So even though you're not telling them what they need to know, you're still guiding them to find out what it is that they need. And that, like I said, leads into some common myths of student-centered learning. So obviously that the teacher kicks back and does nothing is one of them, which obviously is not true. A lot of work to prep into the course. But again, once you have it set, you don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. You can kind of just tweak it and go as future classes come forward based off the students that you had. But the first one that I always get is, this won't work for my students. Okay, you always have somebody that says, oh no, this will never work. They need structure and they need to sit and they need to be quiet and this, that, and the other thing. All the data right now is showing that we're working in the classrooms with Generation Z. So the millennials are gone and we have Generation Z, and they are very engaged and hands-on and tech savvy. So like if a kid wants to know something now, they go right to YouTube and they can find it out in 3 minutes and they know their answer and they can move on. Okay. Or they can find out more. We need to make sure in our classrooms we're matching what their natural learning is. So going with a model that worked for people who had, 20-minute attention spans back in the day is not going to work now when the average attention span is like 7 or 8 seconds. That's a big, big difference. And we need to make sure that if we're teaching them the best way possible, we're doing, what works. Now, with this, okay, number one, I'm going to tell you right now, there will always be that kid. Okay, there's always going to be that one that all year long you're trying to unlock. And sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't. Okay, so you can't say this method obviously isn't working because, Bobby over there, he's just, well, Bobby's like that for everybody. So if you can get through to him, awesome. I've been able personally to get through to some students that nobody's ever been able to work with because of the method here and being able to talk with them one-on-one when they're doing stuff and finding out what they like and creating assignments that appeal to them. But don't throw it all out because, there's that kid. Also, there's always going to be pushback in the beginning when you first start this, especially if they're not used to student-centered learning in general. They at first they think it's great, and then they realize like they've got to do the work in order to understand the information to get what they need to move from part A to part B. And you get a little bit of pushback of, she doesn't even teach. We don't do anything. Like, we always have to be doing stuff and And all of a sudden you start, like, I always laugh when that happens because I know it's coming. But then all of a sudden you just start seeing like a tipping point where like another kid gets it and buys in, and then another kid gets it and buys in. And by the end, again, you might have a couple of, those kids around, but most of them get it and they really appreciate and get it, especially if you keep up with it. Looking at demographics, okay, this study here was done by Stanford, okay, which is pretty great. I would suggest looking up the article if you're interested. It's very fascinating. But it shows that student-centered learning helps close the opportunity gap. And we know as educators, that's something that we really want. We want all of our students to be on the same page, but often that's not the case just because of varying external circumstances that we can't control in our classrooms. But by doing this and, engaging each and every student and not letting them slip through the cracks and, sleep in the back of the classroom because they can, it really helps encourage them to get hands-on into what I like to call learn by accident. Okay. And that is huge with the reason that we're all teachers and what we all want to be able to accomplish. All right. So it really does work for your kids, and it might take a little bit of adjusting. It might take a little bit of training, but once they're in it, like, they're in it to win it. I enjoy this one too, and these cats also cracked me up. The students won't learn as much this way. It's all for show. Okay. If I'm not telling them exactly what they need to know, then how are they going to know it? That's not, I understand why that might be a mentality, because you are the expert in the room, you know the information, you're in the field, okay? You have a degree in being able to teach that. But being the sage on the stage is not going to get through to every single kid, okay? We're not in that generation anymore. You can't talk at them for however long and expect it all to sink in and them to understand it. They might get it, they might remember it, they might cram it, but do they really understand it? Okay, you don't understand unless you do. You can read everything there is to read about riding a bike, okay? But that doesn't mean when you get on the bike, you're going to be able to ride it. You have to practice it, and you have to do it, and you have to put all of the things that you've learned into practice in order to be able to finally ride that bike, all right? By giving the students choice, it piques their interests, and they become more engaged without realizing it, okay? My favorite is I've had in some of my lower level classes, like knockdown, drag out arguments between kids over content and their interpretation of it because they were learning by accident and they were engaging themselves in it. It's mind blowing. Kids that, other teachers would walk by and, oh, man, you have them, good luck. Like, really getting into the material because of how it was presented to them and it never had been before. Okay. To go with that, all right, just some feedback that I've gotten before from some of my students. This one, I actually almost cried when she said it to me, but we were getting ready for exams, and she said, for the first time ever, when it was exam time, I wasn't nervous at all. I already knew the information. Okay, and it was incredible. They sit back and they say, I've learned more in this class than I ever have in a class before because they're engaged in it. They're not just being told what they need to know. They're learning it on their own. Okay. And then, another student said to me once, your method of instruction is brilliant. They had never experienced it before. They went through that adjustment phase. They gave it a shot and they realized like, this is the real deal. This is how it goes. And that's, again, just absolutely huge. And then the last one, and we've already touched on this for a minute. I don't have time to learn a new method of instruction. Some of us might have just graduated from college and you know what you know, and you're just trying to stay above water. Some people are more seasoned and, retirement is in the horizon. And, we just don't have time with all of the paperwork and the lesson planning and, the classroom management and all of that. Like we just don't have time to do this. And I absolutely get it. Nobody has time for anything. And who wants to try to figure out something new that might not work, right? Who wants to take the time to have something just not work itself out? I took that time and it legitimately took me 5 years, 5 years to finally find a method that worked. Okay. Again, there's nothing out there that says this is how a student-centered classroom should be. It says, students should be doing things on their own, but there's not a lot that says like, try this and try this and try this and do it this way and do it this way and do it this way. So for 5 years, I tried it out before I figured it out and found a system that works consistently as much as it possibly can all the time. But you don't have to learn it like I was forced to. Okay. And like I had mentioned, that in itself is why Student-Centered World exists. I am so passionate about this method of instruction that I wanted to go out there and make sure that other people had the opportunity to learn how to do this in a manner that they can implement right away, to know there's like a 99% chance it's going to work out. With a tweak, it'll definitely work. Everybody's classroom is different, but it's going to work out. And I really wanted to put it out there so other people can do this because I believe so much in it. So thank you guys for all coming out. I hope you learned a little bit of something and it's got your wheels turning and you're, ready to sort of jump in and switch the model into a fully student-centered classroom. If at any time you have any questions, admin@studentcenteredworld.com would be more than happy to talk to you. Thank you all so much for coming out. Appreciate it.